Hi, dear friend, and welcome. I'm so glad you're here tonight. Tonight we will take a slow, gentle walk through something vast, yet entirely personal. The living tapestry that is your mind. Now, let us begin. The rain had followed me since dawn. It wasn't the kind of rain that fell in sheets, loud and furious. This was thinner, sharper. It stung the skin when the wind caught it, like hundreds of tiny needles finding every gap in your coat. By the time I reached the old district, my boots were heavy with water, my shoulders aching under the weight of a satchel filled with notes. The street lamps here barely worked. Their glow was weak, jaundiced, leaving the cobblestones in uneven patches of shadow. The archive stood at the far end of the street. If you didn't know it was there, you might walk right past it, a narrow building 3 stories, its windows blackened with age, no sign above the door. No indication anyone had entered in years. I paused at the entrance. The wood was warped, split in places, swollen from decades of weather. It smelled faintly of mold and something metallic, like rust or blood. When the door opened, it wasn't with the creak I expected. It swung silently inward. A man stood in the frame. He was tall, but his posture was bent as if the building's low ceilings had trained him to bow. His coat was an old wool thing, the kind that holds the cold in rather than keeping it out. His eyes flicked to the street behind me before he spoke. "You're here for the case," he said. Not a greeting, not a question. Just a fact, delivered without ceremony. I stepped inside, without answering. The floorboards groaned under my weight, each step echoing too loud in the stale air. The corridor was long and narrow, lined with shelves heavy with dust and old paper. The smell of iron grew stronger with each step. He led me through 2 locked doors, each opened with a different key. No words passed between us. When we stopped, it was in a small room lit by a single bare bulb hanging from a frayed cord. Its glow was yellow, the kind that made shadows cling to the corners. In the center of the room sat a table, on it the case. It was no larger than a shoebox, but solid. A single block of iron, pitted and scarred, no hinges. No keyhole. Its surface was covered in shallow grooves, some straight, some curved, forming an intricate pattern. I reached out without thinking. The metal was cold, not the kind of cold you expect from an object in a chilly room. This was deeper, unnatural, as if the case had been sitting in ice for hours. My fingertips traced the grooves. At first they felt random, but then I realized they weren't scratches. They were coastlines. The man's gaze never left my face. "This," he said in a low voice, "is the last copy of the forbidden map. Lisbon, winter of 1531. The storm had not stopped for 3 days. From the small window of his workshop, Duarte Moreira could see nothing but the violent sway of the mast lines at the docks and the restless churn of the harbor. The air smelled of salt, wet rope, and the faint sourness of fish gone bad. But Duarte worked on, hunched over his table, his back to the window. The shutters were closed tight. He had covered every crack in the walls with cloth to keep prying eyes out. The room was lit by only 2 candles. Their flames sputtered whenever the wind clawed at the shutters. The light was weak, but Duarte's hands did not falter. Spread before him was a sheet of parchment, finer than anything made in Lisbon, pale, supple, without blemish. It had come from far away, traded through silent hands for a coin that bore no king's face. On the parchment, lines took shape. Not the safe, familiar outlines of known lands, but strange coasts that bent the wrong way. Islands, too perfectly round, inlets that cut into the land like blades. His tools were laid out neatly, a bronze compass, a thin quill, and an ink pot that gleamed like obsidian. The ink had been given to him by a sailor who would not say where it came from. It was darker than pitch, and when the candlelight caught it, it shimmered faintly, a color that was almost blue but not quite. A knock at the door. Duarte froze, quill hovering above the parchment. The knock came again. It was not the quick tap of a friend, but slow, deliberate. 3 beats, a pause. 3 more. "It's done?" The voice outside was low, hard, and carried the weight of expectation. Duarte glanced to the corner of his table, where a small leather-bound book lay. Its pages were filled with sketches, ruins beneath ice, spiral carvings on black stone, creatures whose shapes he dared not render fully, and in the margins, symbols, sharp, jagged, repeating patterns that seemed to shift when stared at too long. The knock grew louder. The candles quivered. Duarte bent over the map once more, drawing a final jagged line through an expanse of sea, a fault, a wound beneath the waves. He pressed his seal into the corner, a serpent eating its own tail. As the wax cooled, he whispered something under his breath, not in Portuguese, not in Latin, but in a language no sailor would admit to knowing. The door splintered. 2 men stepped inside, their boots wet from the storm. One carried a curved knife, its blade dull with age. The other held a small iron case. Duarte did not look afraid. Instead, he smiled. It was the smile of a man who knew that whatever they took from him, they could not take it all. "You cannot hide what is already found," he said. By morning, the workshop was empty. The table was bare. And Duarte Moreira's name was erased from every guild ledger as if he had never existed at all. Summer, 1533. The galleon Santa Aurelia left the harbour under a moon that looked like it had been bitten in half. There was no ceremony, no fanfare, no priests blessing the voyage, only the quiet groan of wood as the ship pulled away from the dock, her sails swallowing the night wind. Captain Rodrigo Velasquez stood at the stern, watching Lisbon's lights shrink into a scattering of embers. In his cabin, beneath his bed, wrapped in oilskin, lay the thing worth more than the ship itself, Duarte Moreira's map. He'd told his crew little, only that they were bound for waters beyond the reach of any crown, and that there would be treasure enough to buy 10 ships like this one. For 3 weeks the sea was kind. The days were warm, the wind steady, the stars bright enough to read by. The men sang at their work. Rodrigo did not join them. Each night, he studied the map in the dim light of a single lamp, tracing its coastlines with a gloved hand. He kept it close enough to touch, even when he slept. The first sign came on the 22nd day. The helmsman reported the compass was wandering. At first it was a twitch, no more than a hair's width. Then it began to spin, slow at first, then faster, until it whirled without. Pause as if trying to find a north that no longer existed. On the 25th day, the sea grew unnervingly still. The sails hung limp, but the air was warm and damp. The men swore they could hear something under the silence, faint, low, almost like voices speaking from far below the waterline. By the 30th day, they saw land, not the green rise of an island, but a jagged strip of black rock that rose from the sea like the spine of some great beast. It was slick with a thin sheen of something oily, and the air around it carried the sharp tang of copper. Rodrigo took a small landing party ashore. The coastline matched the map perfectly, every jag, every curve. Inland, the rock gave way to carvings. The figures, etched into the stone, were tall, impossibly tall, their limbs thin as reeds, their faces hidden behind masks with hollow eyes. Around their feet, spirals were carved deep into the rock, all of them pointing toward a narrow fissure in the cliffside. Rodrigo entered alone. The others waited on the shore, staring at the black water. He was gone for nearly an hour. When he returned, he carried the map in both hands, clutching it as though it might vanish. His skin was pale, and his eyes, they were fixed somewhere far away, on something only he could see. Back to the ship was all he said. 3 days later, a merchant vessel spotted the Santa Aurelia, drifting with her sails in tatters. No crew, no cargo. The longboats were gone. In the captain's cabin, the oilskin lay open on the desk, empty. The map was gone. The air smelled faintly, unmistakably, of copper. Winter, 1821. Snow came down in wide, heavy flakes, settling thick on the black peaks of the Carpathians. The air was so cold it burned the lungs. It was the kind of cold that made every sound sharper. The crunch of boots on frost, the creak of leather straps, the faint jingle of metal buckles. Sir Edmund Caldwell had been travelling for 3 weeks. He had crossed frozen rivers, climbed passes where the wind threatened to throw him into the ravine below, and slept in villages where the locals still marked their doors with chalk against the E. Nightwalkers. His destination was St. Brigid's Monastery, or what was left of it. When he finally stood before the ruins, the place felt abandoned for more than centuries. Its walls leaned like broken teeth, its windows were dark sockets. Even the snow seemed reluctant to settle on its stones, sliding off into drifts. Inside, the cold was worse. The wind whistled through cracks in the stone, carrying the faint smell of something metallic, like old iron or fresh blood. He followed a crumbling corridor to a heavy wooden chest banded in, blackened iron. The lock was stiff with rust. It took him nearly an hour to work it open. When the lid creaked back, the smell struck him. Not rot, not damp, but something dry and sharp, almost electric. Inside lay layers of faded cloth. He peeled them back one by one, revealing an iron case about the size of a small loaf. Its surface was scarred with strange, interlocking lines like rivers on a map that led nowhere. There was no latch, no hinge. When he touched it, the metal was cold, but not the ordinary cold of stone or steel. It felt as if it were drawing the warmth from his fingers. Somewhere, inside, something pulsed. It took 3 days and a set of tools borrowed from a blacksmith in the nearest village to open it. When he finally pried the lid loose, the hinges gave way with a dry scream. Inside, wrapped in brittle vellum, was the map. The ink was still rich and dark, as though it had been drawn only hours ago. The coastlines were strange, wrong. Some submerged in his time, others that had never existed in any charted history. Around the edges ran a series of symbols. At first glance, they looked decorative, like the flourishes on illuminated manuscripts, but the longer he studied them, the more deliberate they seemed. He sent sketches of the markings to scholars in London, Cairo, and Calcutta. The first reply came within days. These are not decorations. They are warnings. Destroy the map immediately. Caldwell ignored the advice. He worked late into the night, candlelight trembling over his desk as he traced the symbols. Piece by piece, the meaning began to take shape. It was not a warning about where to go. It was a warning about where never to go. The phrase that emerged from the tangle of glyphs repeated again and again, the places that must never be opened. On the 4th night, the innkeeper found him slumped over the desk. No wounds, no sign of struggle. His face was pale, his mouth half open, as though caught mid-breath. The map lay on the floor beside him, and the room smelled faintly, unmistakably, of copper. By dawn, the map was gone. The envelope was heavier than it should have been. Thick cream paper, edges crisp, the kind you'd expect from a private collector or an old estate. No return address, no sender's name. Just my own, written in perfect block letters, as if typed by hand. Inside was a single sheet. The message was short, the words centered. We believe you can read what others cannot. Come to the archive in Vltava. Midnight the 1st of March. Beneath that, no street name, just a set of coordinates. I almost dismissed it. But when I entered the numbers into my GPS, the location pulled tight in my chest. It was high in the Carpathian Mountains, not far from the ruins of St. Brigid's Monastery, the place where Sir Edmund Caldwell's trail ended. Vltava wasn't on most maps. In fact, when I tried to search it, I found only a few references buried in 19th century travel, logs all brief, all vague, and all ending abruptly. The train north was nearly empty. By the time we crossed into the foothills, I was the only passenger left. Snow was falling in lazy spirals, settling thick on the rails. The air outside was clean but thin, each breath sharp enough to make my lungs ache. The driver didn't speak as he dropped me at the end of the line, only pointed to a narrow road that vanished into the dark pines. The archive was not a building in any conventional sense. It was carved directly into the side of the mountain. Wall of black stone, smooth as glass, with a pair of iron doors so tall they seemed to touch the cliff above. They bore no markings, no hinges, no visible way to open them, yet they swung inward the moment I stepped forward. Inside, the air was still and cold. The walls were damp to the touch. Somewhere far below, water dripped in slow, patient intervals. The sound echoed as if the mountain itself were hollow. A narrow staircase spiraled down into the dark. Each step was worn in the center, as though hundreds of feet had passed here. but the dust on the handrail was undisturbed. At the bottom, a man in a grey coat waited beside a long wooden table. His face was pale, his eyes sharp but unreadable. On the table sat a thick, leather-bound book. The cover was cracked, the title long since worn away. Without a word, he opened it halfway. Instead of turning the page, he slid a thin knife between two sheets and peeled them apart. A slit no wider than a finger had been cut into the binding. From within, he drew an oilskin wrap. The fabric was stiff, its folds brittle with age. When he unrolled it, the map slid out. It matched Caldwell's description perfectly. The strange coastlines, the serpent seal, the symbols running the border like a chain. But there was something Caldwell never recorded. Beneath the black ink, faint and almost invisible, lines glowed pale blue. They weren't drawn, they were burned into the parchment itself, as if etched by heat from the inside out. When viewed together, the black lines and the blue formed two maps in one. The first showed the surface, the second showed what lay below. The man in the grey coat leaned closer, his voice low enough that I felt it more than heard it. "Satellites confirm one site is real," he said, "and no one has ever been inside it." The coordinates lay deep in the northern steppe, in a stretch of land the maps called uninhabited, but the locals called cursed. The journey took 3 days over cracked roads that turned to mud under sudden snow. By the second day, the villages grew smaller. By the third, they were gone entirely. At dawn, we reached a fence of corroded steel poles, strung with 3 layers of barbed wire. A rusted sign leaned at an angle. Letters faded but still legible in Russian. "Do not enter, quarantine zone." Beyond it stretched an endless white plain, nothing but wind and ice, until, in the far distance, the land dipped sharply into a shadow that swallowed the horizon. 2 guards in heavy coats waited at the gate. They checked my papers without a word, then passed me a respirator mask. The metal filters were old, dented, but the man in the grey coat insisted I keep it on. We set out on foot, boots crunching through the crusted snow. The air grew colder with every step, as if the sun's warmth was being drained into the pit ahead. The silence was so complete, I could hear the ice groaning beneath the surface. When we reached the edge, I understood why the map had marked this place twice. The ground simply dropped. Away, a vast sinkhole nearly a mile across, its sides sheer black stone. Snow clung to the upper edges but melted halfway down, revealing the jagged scars of something that had once been molten. The air rising from below was warm, too warm. It carried a faint, metallic scent, copper again, sharp enough to taste. The man in the grey coat clipped a rope to his harness and began the descent. I followed, my gloved hands slipping on the frozen line. The further we went, the darker it became, until even the snowlight above faded into a pale blur. Halfway down, the stone changed. Black basalt gave way to smooth, pale walls. Not natural rock, but something carved. The lines were too straight, the angles too precise. It felt less like climbing into a cave and more like lowering myself into a shaft, built for something that had no need for stairs. At the base, the walls opened into a tunnel so wide the beam of my flashlight barely reached the other side. The air was still warmer here, and damp. Every sound seemed to stretch, as if the stone itself were listening. 100 meters in, the beam caught on something metallic, a door, impossibly tall, seamless, except for a single indentation at its center. It was shaped like the serpent seal from the map. The man in the grey coat stepped forward, pressed his hand against the mark and whispered, "From here on, the map is wrong." The metal groaned, then split down the middle. Beyond it lay a darkness that felt thicker than air. It wasn't just the absence of light. It was as if the space itself resisted being seen. I stepped through, and the door closed behind us. The air inside was heavy, pressing against my chest with every breath. I could hear the rasp of my respirator filter, steady at first, then quicker as my heart began to pound. Our flashlights cut narrow tunnels of pale light into the blackness. The floor was smooth, too smooth, like stone that had been worn by countless feet. Yet there were no footprints, no dust, no sign of life. The tunnel stretched on for maybe 100 meters before opening into a chamber so vast the light never touched the ceiling. Our beams caught the edges of pillars, dozens of them, rising like tree trunks, each carved with the same chain of symbols from the map's border. "Don't touch them," the man in the grey coat said. His voice echoed strangely, as though the air delayed it before sending it back. I moved my light along the nearest pillar, the lueur. Carvings weren't shallow incisions. They were deep, almost tunnels themselves, their grooves lined with something that reflected faintly. It wasn't gold, it wasn't metal, it pulsed. A low hum rose from somewhere deep in the chamber. At first, I thought it was machinery, but it had a rhythm, like breathing. Slow measured, patient. The man in the grey coat stiffened. He raised a hand for silence and switched off his light. I hesitated, then did the same. Darkness swallowed us. But after a few moments, I saw it. Faint blue glows blooming between the pillars, drifting like slow embers. They weren't fixed to the walls or ceiling. They moved. One of them slid closer, the glow intensifying until I could make out a vague shape behind it. Tall, impossibly thin, its outline bending slightly as it moved, as if the air around it was heavier than ours. It stopped. And then, without a sound, every other glow in the chamber went out. We were left in complete, crushing dark. That was when something touched my shoulder. The touch was not like a human hand. It was colder than the air, but not the dead chill of ice. It felt deliberate, as if the fingers were testing the shape of my shoulder. I froze. Every instinct screamed to run, but the man in the grey coat's voice came in a whisper so low I barely heard it. "Don't move." Something shifted in the dark beside me, not footsteps, but the faint ripple of fabric brushing air. A faint scent drifted up, metallic and sweet, like copper dissolved in warm water. I swallowed hard. The hum was back, closer now. It resonated through my chest, making my ribs ache, like it was using me as an instrument. I realized with a slow horror that the rhythm was no longer slow. It matched my heartbeat. Then came the sound. Not a word, not quite. A low, layered vibration that made the inside of my skull feel too small. It wasn't language I could understand, but it carried weight, intent. It was speaking to me. The man in the grey coat did something I didn't expect. He stepped forward into the dark, placing himself between me and whatever loomed there. The glow flared faintly again, just enough to show me the edges of a face that wasn't quite a face, long, smooth planes where features should be, and where the eyes might have been, only the slow pulsing blue. The thing raised one impossibly thin arm and touched the serpent seal hanging from the man's neck. The moment it did, the hum deepened, and a second glow, larger, brighter, bloomed somewhere further inside the chamber. My light was still off, but I didn't need it to see the outline that emerged in that glow. It wasn't just one figure. It was dozens, all standing perfectly still, all facing us. The man in the grey coat's hand closed around my wrist. "We've been found," he said, voice flat. "And now you'll see why the map was never meant to be read." The glow from the dozens of figures held steady, not flickering, not dimming. They were as still as carved idols, yet I could feel their presence pressing in on me. It was like standing in the ocean at night and realizing there are shapes just beneath the surface, circling. The first one, the one who had touched me, moved closer to the man in the grey coat. It didn't speak in words, but the hum returned, rising and falling in a strange cadence. The man answered it in the same tone, his voice vibrating in his throat, unnatural and low. I didn't understand what they were saying, if it was even language, but I could feel something pass between them, a bargain, an agreement. The thing extended its long arm again, palm open. The man removed the serpent seal from his neck and placed it in the pale hand. The instant the seal left his skin, he staggered, catching himself against one of the carved pillars. The glow of the figures brightened. Not like light, more like heat. A suffocating wave of energy that made the air thick and metallic in my mouth. I took a step back, but the chamber seemed to tilt. the pillars bending inward as though the space itself didn't want me to leave. The man in the grey coat turned, to me his face pale and drawn. "You're going to leave here," he said. "They'll let you, but you will take something with you." Before I could ask what, the figure pressed its open palm to my chest. No pain, no wound, just a flood of cold that sank deep, deeper than bone, as if it had placed something inside me. The hum stopped, the figures stepped back into the dark, and the glow vanished, leaving me standing in the same crushing black we'd first entered. Only now, I could feel a faint pulse inside me, a beat that wasn't mine. We retraced our steps in silence. The tunnel felt longer than before, the air colder, though my body was burning from the inside out. Every few steps, I felt that foreign pulse, slow, deliberate, like something was keeping time inside me. The man in the grey coat walked ahead, his shoulders hunched. Without the serpent seal around his neck, he seemed smaller. Like a weight was gone, but not in a way that freed him, more like something had taken its place. When we reached the stone entrance, I expected daylight. Instead, the sky was dim, an oily grey that made it impossible to tell the time. The air outside was no fresher than it had been inside. It carried the same faint metallic taste. We crossed the sand in silence until our camp came into view. The tents were there, the vehicles too. But everything was wrong. The generator was still running, yet no one was around. Mugs of tea sat half drunk, still warm. A radio hissed static, untouched. The man didn't seem surprised. "They're gone," he said flatly. "They saw the glow. They heard the hum." I was about to ask what that meant when it happened. A flicker in the corner of my vision. Not movement, but a memory. A flash of the chamber. The pillars. The blue glow. Only this time, I wasn't looking from my own eyes. I was one of them, staring. At myself, I stumbled, my knees nearly giving out. The pulse inside me quickened, syncing perfectly with the memory. And in the distance, on the horizon beyond the camp, I saw 3 faint blue glows begin to move toward us. "They know where we—" "Tas," the man in the grey coat said, not even looking up. "They always will." That night I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw them. The motionless figures in the dark, their slow pulsing glow like the breath of something ancient. But it wasn't just memory. It felt like I was there. I could smell the metallic air of the chamber. I could hear the hum again, not in my ears this time, but inside my skull, like it was vibrating in my bones. At some point, I realized I wasn't breathing, not because I couldn't, but because I didn't need to. When I gasped for air out of instinct, it didn't feel right. The oxygen burned, almost sour. I stepped outside the tent. The desert was silent, but in that silence, I heard something moving far below the sand. Slow, heavy shifts, as though something enormous was turning in its sleep. I looked down at my hands and froze. The veins on my wrists glowed faintly blue. Not a trick of light, not a reflection. They were lit from inside. The pulse I'd felt in the chamber was now visible, running under my skin like liquid light. The man in the grey coat appeared beside me without a sound. He didn't look surprised. "This is the beginning," he said. "They gave you a piece of their map." I didn't understand, not until I realized I could see in the dark. The dunes around us weren't black shapes anymore. I could make out their exact ridges, the texture of the sand, the tiny, shifting grains, and far out, beyond the horizon, I saw something impossible, a massive pattern etched into the desert floor, a design so large it could only be seen from the sky, or through whatever was now inside me.